live. Thank you so much for tuning in, and thank you to our very special guest, Jonathan Roberts, who has a PhD, and he's a professor of developmental cognitive neuroscience who can literally answer so many questions that I cannot. So I'm so happy you're here.
I'm glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
And so anybody who's watching right now, we love to hear from you. Obviously, there's a lot of things you can do at 8 o'clock on a Wednesday night, and you're spending it with us. So awesome. Thank you. Tell us where you're watching from. Tell us what's going on in your world, and let us know what you want to know. One thing that Jonathan and I were talking about when we were kind of talking about what we would talk about tonight was divided attention. And so I'll be in a meeting and I'm looking at my phone, and depending on what I'm looking at, hi Sarah. Sarah's watching from Nashville. See, just then I'm trying to give an intro, and then I get distracted by technology. So talk about is it called cognitive dissonance?
It's divided attention.
Okay.
So divided attention is basically trying to just what it sounds like, divide your attention, trying to pay attention to two things at once. And particularly if it's in the same modality, like auditory. And we don't really think about it, but when we're reading a post on Facebook or somewhere like that, I don't know about you, but I got a little guy in my head that's talking to me. And the little guy's talking, and he talks in English. And when I think about things, the little guy talks. But so when I'm reading a post on Facebook, I'm reading it in English, and it's very, very difficult to attend to two voices at once. So when we're attending, we kind of think, and we can fool ourselves into thinking that we're attending to two things at once, but we really can't. We can switch back and forth really quick, but we can't actually attend to two things at once. An example that I oftentimes use is I'm a dude, I like to watch football, and I can watch two football games at once, but I've got to switch back and forth because I've only got one TV in my living room. And I can mostly follow the football games, but I'm clearly missing stuff because I'm only watching one thing at a time. And it's sort of the same thing with our attention with regard to voices, with regard to reading the internet, looking at our computer. We actually are attending to one thing at a time. So while we fool ourselves into thinking we're dividing our attention or we're multitasking, we're really not. And there's all sorts of scientific literature that would indicate that we're definitely not able to divide our attention. We can fool ourselves. We can switch back and forth very quickly, but we're not very good at attending to things at a time.
And that's huge because, I mean, before 2009, before I got an iPhone, I was very able to focus. It was amazing. Then I got this thing, and I obviously became James Bond and the Nut Professor. So that's so redeeming to know that you literally cannot focus on more than one thing at a time.
It's funny. One of my students posted on Facebook yesterday that he was walking across campus and he literally ran into a post because he was reading his phone. So he was one of those people that, and it was just, again, he's attending to his phone. He's not even watching where he's looking.
I can't tell you how many times I've been trying to respond to an email or text. And, there's steps with big yellow lines that say, watch out, you're about to, lose some elevation. And I will just completely eat it and then look around and nobody saw it. And that's really kind of disappointing because so,
did you do the jog thing? You meant to do that?
Oh, ninja. There's an invisible ninja following me at all times.
And I think when we feel, or when I feel, I'm going to project a little bit, when I feel the worst about it is when I'm attending to my phone and the kids are talking and they're like, Dad, what about me? And you're like, what?
I really struggle with that because, a lot of people are concerned, including us, about the emotional and mental well-being of this next generation. And there's, a cohort that say, well, this generation has emotionally unavailable parents. And I get it. I'm guilty of being in the room physically, but not mentally, because I'm distracted. So I've really tried to make an effort to just shut it down, turn it off, turn it over, turn notifications off, because I was starting to feel like a hamster in a wheel.
I think that's certainly one tactic that you can use to make yourself emotionally and psychologically available to your family, because there's a lot of relationships, whether it's marriages or just boyfriends, girlfriends, that get sidetracked by your phone. And I know I'm a little bit older, and when I see young people out on a date and they're both like looking at their phone, I go, oh, that's awful. It's like, they're young, they're the throes of passion, but they're looking at their phone. But it is a generational difference too, and I think we've just got to figure out how to work through that as generations, and make sure that we're both engaged with whoever we're present with. But I think there's also it's hard because there's a little bit of an expectation now, especially, that we will respond to emails, we will respond to Facebook messages, and those, like yourself, who's in a technology-oriented business, if somebody sends you an email at 8 o'clock at night, they kind of expect that you're going to respond tonight.
No, it's hard. It's hard to separate the work-life balance, the tech-life balance. But we're unique because we have both lived in a world pre this sort of technology and then post. But you specialize in studying younger brains and how it's affecting them. So before we get into, I would love for you to highlight kind of your specialty, but give parents watching and listening just a background on, like, you're a dad, and how old are your kids, and what does your world look like?
Sure. So I have two kids. I have a daughter who's 10, and I have a son who just turned 13. And it's interesting because our son really is not that into technologies, other than really watching YouTube videos. That's sort of the only thing. We have to, like, make him take his phone to. He just went on a trip to Kennedy Space Center, and he was gone for 3 days. We're like, "Luke, be sure to remember your phone," because that way we can get in touch with you if we want to. So it's more for us really right now than it is for him. Our daughter, who's 10, is all about the technology. So she's constantly, and she doesn't have a phone that's connected to cell signal. She's only got one that's connected to Wi-Fi, and that's on purpose. But she's constantly wanting to use that phone. So she's figured out how to use Google Hangouts to make actual phone calls, to do basically video chatting, all of those things. And so those are the, I don't know if fears are the right word, but those are the things that we kind of worry about, because we don't know exactly all the time who she's connecting to and what's happening in that world. I probably shouldn't even admit this on national whatever live Facebook, but she actually, at her school, they were using, they have a lunch number to get their lunch, and then to log into everything at their school was their lunch number and your birth date. So if you knew somebody's lunch number and your birth date, you could log into their stuff.
You're kidding.
And she did that in 5th grade. So she logged in as somebody else, and she got in big trouble. And I don't think she realized how bad it was. Like, we've never had the "you're not allowed to hack somebody else's account" kind of talk, because she's in 5th grade. But we got to work through that.
Oh my gosh. Well, I really appreciate you sharing not only that story, but just kind of where you are in terms of digital parenting, because I talk to a lot of parents about a lot of different things. Every parent is in a different stage of life. Every child has a different maturity level. Every family has a different dynamic. And the question I give above all from any parent, regardless of where they and their family are, is just, what do you do? Titania, what do you do? What devices does your son have? What does he spend his time on? How do you keep him safe? People look to people like you and me to kind of guide them on you know, what do you do? Because there's been nobody else has parented in a digital age. We're the first. Yay!
Right, right. So, in terms of our devices, both of our kids have Chromebooks, and they both have tablets. And I think tablets are probably their favorite. We're an Android family. We're not an Apple family. So they have Android, their Chromebooks, Android devices. And our daughter has an old Android phone that, like I said, it's just connected to Wi-Fi. Our son has a phone basically because he does travel soccer and stuff like that. And we wanted to be able to get in touch with him. We use Bark. So shout out for Bark. And luckily thus far we haven't had any sort of problems. Nothing's popped up. It was kind of cool to see the word clouds that pop up associated with both the kids, and neither of them surprised me much in terms of the word clouds. And it's been cool because I think for us it was smart that they were young enough that when we started them on Bark, they didn't care, and they didn't feel like it was any sort of invasion of their privacy or anything like that. We just described it as, hey, this is something we want to make sure that you're safe, and if anybody's doing anything, saying anything to you, we want to know about it, and you don't even have to tell us if you'll let us do this. So we've been really that's been it made us feel better about that.
That's huge. Yeah, we really appreciate obviously parent feedback, but also the children that are being kept safer on the platform. We want to hear the pros and cons because we try to differentiate ourselves by actually respecting their privacy, right? Like we don't need any more helicopter parents in this world. We've got to give them, a certain amount of freedom. That said, there's just so many more dangers than when we were children.
There definitely are, and as a college professor, you talk about helicopter parents. We've laughed and said it's gone beyond helicopter. They're like moving in, and I see so many of our young people, our college age students that arrive on a campus that just aren't equipped to handle a lot of things that I feel like they should be equipped to handle. And maybe that's generational and it may not be fair. A lot of them, they're not driving.
I know, it's crazy.
They're not cooking. We actually had to initiate something on campus that they had to go through a program at the dorm before they were allowed to use the kitchen because they were setting stuff on fire.
You are kidding me.
No, I'm not. I'm really not. And I don't think there are people that say, young people today or there's something wrong. I don't think there's anything wrong with them, right? No. I think that what I think is that parents just have been so much more involved that we don't realize how much we're doing for them.
Oh my gosh.
Our job as a parent is not necessarily to do things for them, but to get them ready to do things for themselves. And I think our kids hate it. I say this so often. Whenever I correct them, I oftentimes say, what's my job? And they're like, your job is to get us ready to go into the world, And so that's my thing is I say, you need to know how to do this. You need to know how to do laundry. You need to know how to fold laundry. You need to know how to unload the dishwasher. You need to know how to write an email, to write a thank you letter. And when they kind of complain, I'm like, what's my job? And they're like, your job is to get us ready to go into this world. And so, whether it's driving or writing a thank you letter, doing laundry, those types of things, these are all things that they need to know how to do so that we can set them free. Because a lot of 18-year-olds I see, their parents, and I don't want to pick on any parents, but it's like they send them off to college to get them ready for the world. Well, they really better be ready when they get to college because they're going to have a tough time when they show up if they're not quite ready.
Oh my gosh, you've got so many things I need to do. Because again, you're right. Like it's great that we're teaching them foreign languages and coding and yada yada yada. But like, my 9-year-old does not know how to do laundry, and I think he is quite ready to do that. So that'll be.
Yeah, I know. I play with cars, and I'm like, whenever I'm working on my car, I'm like, come on, let's go. I want you to teach you how to change the oil or whatever. Those are types of things. And it just, all the different things, and that's probably not important for everybody, but, just to teach them the skill set to get ready for the world. And I think that, college is important. I have to think that. I'm a professor. But I also think that there's some life skills that are super important that if we're not teaching them, that they're not ready to go.
So kind of thread of old school versus new school, we also were talking about note taking and how it's changed over the years.
Sure.
So give us some insight into, is it better to handwrite notes, or can you really take notes and commit them to memory if you're on your laptop?
Sure. So I will tell you that when laptops first became sort of the norm in the classroom, I was really excited. I thought, man, this is like the best thing because my handwriting is hideous. Like I can barely read my own handwriting. And I thought if I could have typed my notes, if I could have sat on a laptop and typed my notes in college, not only could I read it, but I also type much faster than I write. And so I think there's still a push to push a lot of technology into the classroom. So a lot of high schools, grade schools, even colleges are issuing laptops. And somebody asked the question, is this really better? Is it really better from a scientific standpoint? Do students learn better on their laptop? And what we found out is there's a couple problems with the laptop. The first one is distraction, particularly with the availability of Wi-Fi. Students, a large percentage of students are not on task when they're on their laptop. I didn't realize that. I'm an old guy at our university, and we're asked to go watch our younger faculty members teach. And the way that I almost always do that is I sneak in right as class starts, and I sit in the very back because I don't want students to see that their teacher's being observed. And I happen to be watching somebody who is really, really good. He's one of our best professors. And I was so disappointed. There were about 10 students on laptops, and at some point during the lecture, about 8 of them were doing something other than taking notes. And I know for me, like, I'm sort of the same way. When I've got work I'm supposed to be doing at work, it's not unusual for me to work for a few minutes and then I need to check my email, make sure nothing's come in that I need to deal with. So that is problematic. But perhaps more problematic than that is there's some pretty current research studies that are coming out that look at students that take notes by hand versus take notes on the computer. And the students that take notes by hand tend to do better on a quiz that's given right after the lecture. So these are studies that have been done at universities. And it turns out there's a couple reasons why. One of them is the same thing that makes taking notes on a laptop super easy, that we can type faster than we can write, is that it allows us to type almost verbatim what's being said. Okay, so when I'm talking to you, there's sort of 2 ways for you to interpret that. One is you take every word that I say and you transcribe it. The other way to do it is that you can actually take what I'm saying, interpret it, put it into your own words, usually shorter, and write it down. And the act of interpreting, usually shortening, putting it in your own words seems to be really important to that cognitive process of learning. And typically, from a cognitive standpoint, we don't store events. We store interpretations of events. And that's sort of, I know that's like a vague concept, but if you think back to like the Super Bowl, right? Think back to the Super Bowl, I don't know what you took away from the Super Bowl. You may know who won. You may not know who won. You may remember a couple of key events. Those key events may or may not be how they actually happened, but you're storing your interpretation of those events. And so in class, we're kind of doing the same thing, is we're taking whatever somebody says, you know, anybody that's watching this broadcast is listening to me, and they're going to store whatever event. And what they may store, which would be fine with me, is, well, you're better off taking notes by hand.
That's fascinating. A few things on that note. One is, if you ever were out sick in class and you just asked to borrow somebody's notes and you read them and you're like, okay, I kind of get it, but man, it would have been so much better if I were there.
Oh yeah, and what's really interesting. That's an awesome observation, because I say this all the time. Thank you. We plan this. Is that when we store information, we store not only the target information, but we store the information that surrounds that information. So, for instance, in class, when I'm talking about a concept, so I'm talking about reinforcement. We have a dog named Kobe, and I may say, Kobe, my example of reinforcement is I say, Kobe, sit. Kobe sits, and he gets a treat. We call that positive reinforcement, right? And so people don't write down Kobe. They don't write it down in their notes. And I tell dumb stories about my kids or my wife or about racing cars, and people don't encode that information. However, when I say don't encode it, they don't write it down. So they encode it, but what happens is that makes it easier to remember the information later. So an example of that I sometimes use in class, I say, if I stood up on the table and took my shirt off and said something, it doesn't matter what I said, you would remember it the rest of your life, right? Because you would have that vivid mental image of me standing on a table, my professor on a table with his shirt off. Whatever I said would be ingrained into your memory forever because it's associated with this wild act.
Yeah.
And so when you're trying to read somebody else's class notes, it's the same thing, because you're missing all that information that gets encoded around that information.
Yes, the nuance. That's so true. What about, there are different learning styles. Some people are visual, kinetic, auditory, etc. Me, personally, I think, I've never been tested, but I'm a very visual learner. For example, okay. I would take notes in class. Sometimes I would kind of really need help trying to figure out an answer. I would envision my notes, and I'd be like, man, like what did I write on that line about the flower and the heart? Like, what was that word? Like I actually take a mental snapshot of my notes. Somehow it helps me to remember it. Does that apply to everyone, or does it depend on your learning style?
That's a great question. So I learn like you learn. We talk about this a lot in class, is that everybody has their own learning style. In terms of learning notes or class notes or learning information from class, I've had students that say I'm really an auditory learner. And what some of them have done is they don't take any notes in class.
Right.
So they feel like I'm distracted by taking notes in class. And they say, I'm going to record the class so that I can take notes later. So during class, I'm going to spend 100% of my energy focused on listening to you, processing it, trying to digest it, think about it, and then I'll go back and worry about taking notes later. I've even had students say, I listen to your lecture repeating and it helps me sleep. I'm sure I don't know if that's the nicest thing I've ever heard.
I mean,
I put them to sleep.
Podcast, right?
Okay. Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. And so, but in other students, especially for folks like yourself that feel like you're a visual learner, one of the things that I say is it's super important to put notes on paper, because like you said, you'll remember, okay, it's above this, it's below this, it's that spot in the middle with the flower and the heart. Like that's the part I need to remember. And you can take that mental snapshot, and some people call that photographic memory, and it's not really photographic memory. It's just more of a visual memory, a spatial memory, because of where it is on the page. And that works for some students. And it's interesting because I have some students that really like, for instance, to use note cards. So they test themselves with flashcards, with like the word on one side, the definition on the back. And for me, that's like the very worst thing I could have ever done, because you take all this organization that you have on the paper, you put into a note card, you usually shuffle them up. And it's like, where was that? Right? That's good for me. That's good to test myself, but it's not good to learn. But I have students that swear by them, and they do really, really well. So figuring out sort of what your style is going to be super important. And the earlier the kids can figure that out, the better that is. It's interesting because speaking of styles, my son was complaining on the way home today because I guess his science teacher is asking them to learn some things on their own. And he said, "Oh, Dad, he's just being lazy. He doesn't want to teach us." And I said, "Yeah, I see how you feel that way. However, part of sort of life of moving forward with education is you've got to be able to take books, to take other things and figure them out yourself." And I said that in and of itself is a type of learning, the learning of being able to teach yourself. So it's a different style altogether. And some people would rather listen to somebody give a lecture. Some people would rather read a book. And I oftentimes use that example when somebody says, "I'm thinking about taking an online class." And I'll say, if you want to learn how to do something, would you rather somebody show you how to do it, or would you rather read a book?
Interesting.
And if they say, "I'd rather read a book," I'd say, online's perfect for you. If they're like, "No, no, 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 I want somebody to tell me how to do it." I'm like, I don't know if you want to do online.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I want somebody to show me how to do it. I want to see how you do it. I can burn it into my brain, and then through practice, repeat it, and then it, becomes memory. It's interesting when you were talking about note cards. So I have a lot of recurring, I don't know if you call them nightmares or dreams, about showing up for a test, not knowing about it, not having studied, it's midterms, whatever. And I also have had both real life instances and nightmares about spending so much time making the note cards that I didn't actually absorb what was on the note card. They look really, the handwriting's impeccable, but didn't actually absorb what was on them as much as I should have. Just spent less time studying and not drawing. So.
Right. So you spent all the time making the card instead of actually studying.
Yeah. So I made really great study materials for the person who learns really well that way. But unfortunately, I should have just made a one sheet.
There you go. So then you could have memorized where it was on the page.
Yes. You know a lot about a field and a specific area of expertise that, frankly, I don't know anybody else, who has studied what you studied. So for people who want to kind of venture down the path of where you hang out these days in terms of your intellectual focus, where would you say they start? Where are some good resources for people to kind of learn about everything cognitive and neuroscience?
Yeah. So in terms of cognition, a couple of the authors that I really, really like and that sort of marry the fields of cognition and also behavioral economics. Malcolm Gladwell does some amazing stuff.
Yep.
He also ventures into social psychology. He did a podcast the last 2 years called Revisionist History that I thought was amazing. I listened to both seasons of it. I just think he does maybe the best job of anybody that I know of taking very dense scientific journal articles. They're kind of tough to read. If you ever sit down, if you need, if you're having problems with insomnia, pull out some journal articles. It will put you to sleep, right? There's good information in there. It's just dense. But what he does is he takes that information, he does that thing of taking it in and digesting it, putting it in his own words, and he's just so much more colorful than most scientists. And so when he talks about those articles, he wrote a book called Blink. It's about 10 years old at this point, but it's still really relevant, which really is cognitive psychology, sort of in a snapshot. But it doesn't feel like cognitive psychology because it's really interesting and easy to read. So I definitely recommend all of Malcolm Gladwell's stuff, Blink, Outliers, really good stuff. And the Freakonomics guys also have some super good information. Again, it's sort of marrying the fields of psychology, behavioral economics, and we don't really think of economics and psychology as being related, but they're really tied together. So much so that when I joined my current university, we were part of the Department of Behavioral and Social Sciences. So economics and psychology were in the same department. So you kind of think of economics and business, and you think of psychology and clinical psychology, abnormal psychology, but really cognitive psychology is more of the science, the rat side of psych.
Awesome. Jonathan, I don't know if you were worried when I asked you to come on Facebook Live for 30 minutes straight about how we were going to fill the time, but rest assured, we have filled it, and we can.
Oh, we have. Okay, good.
We can. There's a lot of things we could talk about, but I want to
sure.
give time. You have a lot of things to do. I got emails piling up. So if you're watching and you've emailed me, I promise I'll get to it. But thank you so much for being a part of this. Thank you for sharing both your parenting journey and your professional, know-how with us. It'd be great if you wouldn't mind, if anybody had any questions, to respond to them in the comments, drop some of those links to some of the Malcolm Gladwell books you referenced, and what was the other one? The
Freakonomics?
Yes. See, that's why I need you to do that, because I'm
and also the Freakonomics guys also have a podcast.
Yes.
So if you like podcasts, both of those, I highly recommend them.
Awesome. Cool. Well, Jonathan Roberts, you are doing some cool things in this world. Thank you so much for your support of Bark and for being with us tonight.
I'm so happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.